strikers, special hospitals and police. Imagine that the strike has been going for about 2 weeks. The harbour is full of ships that can't load and unload. The strikers have occupied the wharves, staffed the gates and controlled movement in both directions. They held the wharves with great discipline and organisation for that length of time. Meanwhile, the government and the police were building up a force to retake the wharves from the strikers. There were not enough police in the country to do the job. That's the event that we are commemorating today. It was a crucial moment in the strike. It saw the demise, the breaking finally of the strike, and an immensely significant and colourful event in our history.
Directly across the road here from the employers.
We've got
birthday today.
No mai haere mai, no mai ngā tangata o Whanganui-a-Tara, no mai with the General Strike 1913 City Walk. Welcome, thrice welcome, you the people of Wellington, to our walk of 1913 General Strike.
And it wasn't containerisation the way we know it. It was tough wharf work, and it was also very much like today, it was casual labour. What's new since the 1913 strike? It's quite a lot is exactly the same, and the casualisation of labour, no contracts, no regularity of work is exactly what's happening again in the Auckland waterfront. So
here we are at what is actually the new boardroom, even though it looks like the old one. This was in fact got going in the mid-1920s as the boardroom of the Wellington Harbour Board.
So I'd like to set the scene for 1913 internationally to get the spirit of what was happening in the world at the time of the strike. We had a world in social and political unrest. Most significantly, of course, was the revolts going on in Russia. The peasants and the workers of Russia were challenging the Tsar, and had a number of revolts that had been put down quite brutally by the Cossacks. They were the stormtroopers of the Tsar. And it was about 4 years later, of course, that the Tsar fell. In America, in 1905, the International Workers of the World was established. And this was a militant group of workers who banded together with the aim to create unrest across the world, and through striking and not political means, bring about change and challenge the political structures, particularly capitalism in the world. And the International Workers of the World, their first major strike that I've been able to read about was in New England, when women took the forefront, and the clothing workers, many tens of thousands of them, went on strike for, and it was called the Bread and Roses strike. Give us bread by all means, but we want roses at the same time. And this became a huge rallying call. And in that strike was the first presence of a picket line was used way back then.
In 1890, there had been another big waterfront strike, and it had got squashed pretty severely by the government at the time. And after that, the Liberals took power in 1890, and they introduced the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act, which was a whole different way of thinking about work, and where things had to be negotiated. There weren't to be strikes, there weren't to be lockouts, there was to be negotiation. And the workers thought that was a really good thing, in fact. And at the beginning it was, but then eventually, as the new century went on, there was inflation and there was downturn in the economy, the workers began to realise it wasn't such a good thing, and the employers thought it was a really good thing. And in the process also, the farmers decided they would form a union together, and the employers formed a federation. So you ended up with this, the beginning of this them and us situation, the workers and the employers and the farmers. And that set the scene for what happened here in Wellington. That really, like a kind of class struggle. It was more than a strike, it was a class struggle.
In 1912, a new government came into power. The Reform Party by William Massey was the Prime Minister, and that was definitely a Conservative party. It was supported by the farmers and the employers of the country. And he came in with a prime purpose to break the unions, particularly the Federation of Labour that had been set up in that period just prior. So he was looking for an excuse, I'm sure, to give the workers a hard time, and in 1913 he got this opportunity, although he had an opportunity just before in 1912 in Waihi, when the coal miners went on strike and gold miners up there. And that strike had been brutally put down as well by the police, and he used this idea of Cossacks, or he called them special forces for the territorial army. He used them in Waihi, and that was where the first worker got killed in New Zealand by the police. He was hit by a baton in Australia. His name was Evans, and it was called Black Tuesday by the Union movement, and remembered from that day onwards. And many of the strikers and their families, wives and children, were driven out of Waihi and weren't permitted back into the town again. So that was the build-up to 1913. So the place of engagement was the issue for the workers, and it was particularly the issue for 35 shipwrights. These were skilled craftsmen, carpenters particularly, who did work for the board. And this board made a decision which was, from now on, you will be paid from when you get to your place of work. Prior to that, you got paid, you reported to the engagement room, the donkey room, and were paid from that point on. So wherever you worked on the wharf, you went there, reported, from that moment you were paid. So if you had to go to a wharf down that end, you were paid as you got there. And that was not so bad, because it wasn't far to go. But in 1912, they opened up the slipway in Evans Bay. Still there today, you can go and see the remains of it. It had only just opened in 1912, and this board made the decision that from now on you have to get to your place of work and we'll pay you then. So for those shipwrights, that was a huge issue. From the city, they had to come to the donkey room, report in, and then get over to Lyle Bay, and they didn't get paid till they got there. Well, we could get there in a bus in a few minutes, or car, but imagine trying to get over there on a tram or up over the hill or walk or whatever way they went. So they were really angry and pissed off, to be honest. Then the board made a decision that they would cut 2 of the public holidays of the workers. You were allowed, the government gave workers 4 public holidays, and the employer could determine another extra 2 if they wanted to. And the workers on the wharf had 6 altogether, and the board just in 1912 decided they'd cut 2 of them.
In Auckland there was a general strike. In Wellington, the main groups involved was the watersiders. They were backed by the drivers, who were also of course involved in working on the waterfront, and a lot of the other workers around the town who didn't actually go on strike nevertheless gave support to it. And this was the thing behind the strike that happened here. There, which is now the Huddart Parker building, was in those days the Queen's Chambers. And that was where the headquarters of Waterfront, the Wellington Watersiders Workers Union was. Also they had the Seamen's Union. So you had this situation where they're directly confronting each other across the road, so to speak. And on two occasions, 24th and 25th of October, they invaded the wharves, stopped anyone who was working on the ships from working there and brought the wharves to a halt. And the bosses were quite keen on it being a strike because it was a bad time to go on strike. It was late spring, early summer, shearing was only just beginning, all your lambing and calving was over, good time to get farmers in these specials. At the same time, weather's getting warmer, freezing works and that aren't operating, it's not the slaughtering season, so coal wasn't in big demand, so it's not such a good time for a miners' strike. Essentially, the unions involved were at their weakest as far as economic leverage went at the time of the strike, so it wasn't such a good time to go, and it was good for bosses in the government because it was a time when they could rely on farmers and rural labourers to act as specials. But what had happened is once the workers had stopped the work on the wharves by literally invading the wharves 2 days in a row, then Cullen, who was the head of the police commissioner, said he couldn't keep things under control and he wanted them to use the army against the strikers. The only army we had at that time was one permanent regiment, the Regiment of Artillery based up Buckle Street, and their head, a chap called Hurd, said no way, if we're going to use the army as police, then they need to be there with guns and doing the whole business. He literally said they shouldn't use them unless it was to shoot people. So he was against them using them, and he said instead, and this is what they did, they would use the territorial structure, because at this time you had a system of compulsory military training. Now, in the cities, Auckland and Wellington, and this is quite telling, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, all the territorials there had to bring their guns in and give them into the government. But in the countryside, they used the territorial structure, because the officers knew everyone there, to recruit local farmers and rural labourers as special constables, got them all armed up with batons and got their horses and brought them in to Wellington and later into Auckland, Christchurch and Dunedin to break the strike.
So farmers responded pretty quickly to that. They were also keen to do the workers here in the city. And contingents of them were formed in George Atkins. His diary reports that 25 signed up immediately in the Vin, and they came down by train with their horses from the train, some in the Wairarapa, some as far as Napier and Manawatu farms to the north. Up to 1,000 of them eventually took up the offer. They weren't all farmers, of course, university students, sons of businessmen in the city were also took up the offer because they were paid. They were offered 10 shillings a day. It's quite a lot of money, and also travelling time. So it's interesting that they got paid travelling time, but the shipwrights on the wharf weren't paid travelling time. The government paid. Yep.
This was one of the areas where the big crowds gathered. Essentially, in a way, this is like your sort of trench warfare, where you've got your enemies only so far apart. Because, as I say, over there's where the Harbour Board head office, where the board had their meetings. Over there's the actual administration part of the Harbour Board. Behind you, in the old days, over here was the Queen's Chambers, with the headquarters of both the Watersiders Union and the Seamen's Union. The seamen at first did not go on strike, but then in early November they did go out. But as you can see in that picture, this used to have the big meetings, and the radical speakers would come and try and fire everyone up. So you had people like Bob Semple, known as Bob the Ranter, you had Pat Hickey, you had Harry Holland, who I think is the guy in the photo there. Harry Holland was at that time editor of the Maori Land Worker, which was the strikers' newspaper, the unionist newspaper. A lot of these people were in favour of what they called revolution. That didn't necessarily mean the violent overthrow of the government, they often sort of bring it about in peaceful means through either industrial action or a combination of industrial action and politics. But they envisage revolution as a complete turnover of the system to a socialist system. So that element was going on in this struggle as well. And that same day there was a warship, HMS Pyramus, in port here, and they had to actually get the sailors from the warship out with rifles and bayonets to parade on the wharves. And they also got the ship's machine guns out and very publicly cleaned and prepared them. And this apparently, they didn't actually use any of these things on the strikers there at the wharves, but this apparently calmed matters down somewhat. But then that same day, mounted police, this was regular police, led a group of mounted specials directly through the crowd here at Post Office Square, and this turned into a major scrap. There was a whole lot of battening, charging around the horses, and according to some of those on the strikers side of things, at least one of the specials pulled a revolver and may have fired it. The newspaper reports being pro. The specials said no, that didn't happen, but I leave it up to, I mean, we don't know to be exact, but it's quite possible that it did. So from this time on, you were starting to develop a thing where Wellington was turning into a site of major struggle. There were even guys in their 70s among the Cossacks, and Elston Best, who was actually living in Wellington at the time, who was a very famous ethnologist, the guy who did a lot of the work on Māori and stuff, he joined the specials, thought it was marvellous, and he dragged out from his gear a Texas Rangers uniform that he had, his cowboy gear that he got during his days travelling around the States. So he rode around Wellington dressed up as a cowboy, battening people.
This is the Featherston Street battle, happened on this corner mainly, but the full length of Featherston Street really. They had about 600 Cossacks had come down from Bucket Street, and they came in waves, wave after wave after wave, galloping down the street at full power. This street was full of workers on strike, and as the horses went through, the workers would scatter under the balconies of the buildings, and as soon as the horses went through, they went back out in the street again.
In those days, you didn't have the weekend as you have it now. Sunday was a day off. The Watersiders actually used to get a half holiday on Saturday, or they often preferred to actually work then because it meant they got overtime. But for the majority of Wellingtonians, their half holiday came on a Wednesday, which is what the 5th of November was. So that meant that there were big crowds in town on the afternoon of the 5th of November. And essentially, somewhere up around the other end of Willis Street, the fighting started. So people started throwing things at the specials down there, various sort of charges and things, but it was at Featherston Street itself that what they called the Battle of Featherston Street really got going. There were specials charging the strikers, strike supporters, people throwing all sorts of things at them, people chucking nails and things down to the horses. It wouldn't have been a very good time to be a horse. And now the trammies, as they called them, the tramway workers, had not gone on strike, but many of them were strong supporters of the strike, and there were many reports of specials being thrown off the trams by the tram drivers or conductors. And on this occasion, several trammies tried to run over specials and their horses with the trams, and in one case they were successful in that, which would have been very messy and very unfortunate for the horse involved, which had to be put down. So it was a full-on battle, and it just would have been chaos all around here.
Once they had attempted to clear the workers off the street, they swept down into Custom House Quay and went onto the wharf and cleared the workers off the wharf, and very successfully. And from the 5th of November, the Harbour Board took back control of the wharves, and the specials were used then to create boundaries right along the wharves. They had picket lines of Cossacks.
And it's quite an interesting story here that was reported in the newspaper on the day after the 5th of November. And it says, "The Whitcomb and Tombs imbroglio. Between 4:30 and 5 on Thursday afternoon, two friends were having a drink in Barrett's Hotel when they heard a hell of a boom to put it in the colloquial language of the Narita. Out they dashed, saw a crowd lower down in Lambton Quay and made for the scene of the disturbance. On reaching the spot, they saw two fellows rush into the shop of Whitman Tombs, supported by two policemen who rushed in with them. An attempt was made to hold the door against the furious mob. Mixed with the crowd were several special constables armed with pick handles, waiting for an opportunity to assist the regular police. One pick handle was grabbed by a striker and was laid with a mighty force on a nearby constable's head. In the meantime, those inside the shop had succeeded in closing the doors. Thereupon the mob became infuriated and started an onslaught with sticks and stones on the glass front of the premises. By this time, the quay was absolutely blocked by the crowd.
Then a clash was suddenly made by a contingent of mounted and foot policemen. They charged Melville through the mass spectators, irrespective of their innocence or guilt. Batons in the hands of both John Hobbs, that's the name given for police in those days, and the public flashed right and left. Horses were ridden onto the pavement and were within a very little of crashing through the large plate glass windows. Things looked ugly for a while, and free fights were frequent. However, it soon leaked out that the fleeing victims of the crowd's resentment had escaped through the back door and had climbed onto the Wellington Terrace, and the spectators wended their way back to Post Office Square in search of more excitement. It's a report from the Maryland Worker on the 30th of October.
But as you can see, there's a bit more than what you expect on your usual day at the bookshop. And one also has to wonder, and it gives you an idea of the gun laws of the time, that why does that bunch of characters working at a bookshop all have revolvers?
Peter has done some research on the number of guns that were available in Wellington, and all the gun shops, which presumably there was quite a lot of, were empty of guns. So all the strikers had guns too. So it's a wonder that no one was killed. Or, I mean, there were some injuries, quite severe injuries, but no one was actually killed.
So there weren't the laws on guns?
Absolutely not the laws on guns that there are now. More like, dare I say, America. So yeah. And the other thing that is interesting is to think of what the streets would be like in terms of smells. With 1,000 horses going around, there was lots of horse poo everywhere. And would you believe the city council refuse collectors supported the strikers? So they didn't want to collect the poo. So one of the guys had a little girl and he asked about that, and the little girl said, "What about the horses' poo?" And it was see, and at the same time, the young guy writing his diary, it was on the front, it was a campaign. So one of the things in that big Featherston battle, because I mean there's a picture here of the lining up to charge. That was them all set here, just here to charge on Featherston Street, and a lot of people got injured, and they were taken to the railway station where we had, would you believe, some nurses to help them. So whether they were in favour or not, at least they put it aside and patched up the injuries of both sides, I think. Were to do, and they had rounds, they had patrol areas, they had to patrol certain areas and do certain things, and sometimes he said they went round 22 times in a day. In the morning they would go and refresh their horses down at Arran Bay, get them in the sea, and then they would come back and then they have the patrol, the area of Wellington, they were all over.
Selina Anderson and Jane Donaldson were both very involved in a thing called the Distress Committee, which was the outfit set up to provide food and medical care and all that to the strikers during the time of the strike. And I'll talk about that a bit more when we're near to the end, because it was based out of a socialist hall in Manners Street, which is no longer there, but we'll see the site of it. But this building over here, the A&P Chambers, this was built in the 1920s, but there was an older A&P Chambers there in the day, and inside one of the rooms in there was rented by United Federation of Labour. So their headquarters was in there, and it was also the headquarters of the Social Democratic Party. In the middle of 1913, the Federation of Labour had increased its size, brought in other moderate unions and changed its name, and they'd also set up their own socialist party, which Peter Fraser, who later became Prime Minister of the Labour Party, of course, was the main organiser for. And at that stage he was a militant, another one of the militant socialists who was strongly in favour of the revolution.
Yeah, and he was talking about
The establishment press portrayed the specials as square-jawed sons of the soil coming in to save the city from these foreign ideas of his evil red feds. Whereas the socialist press, which you had the Maryland Worker, there was also, surprise, surprise, the New Zealand Truth in those days was a left-wing paper, not the right-wing scandal sheet it became later. It was still a scandal sheet, but it was a left-wing scandal sheet then. There was also a newspaper brought out by the Wobblies called the Industrial Unionists. These papers portrayed the opposite. They portrayed the strikers as manly people defending their rights and the rights of their class, and the specials as a bunch of drunken scum from the country who'd come in to cause trouble. Now the significance of this little shop, it was a tailor's shop at the time. It was also Wellington's anarchist bookshop at the time. A chap called Philip Josephs, who was a Jewish Latvian tailor. He'd come out to New Zealand, I think about 1911. Our mate Jared Davidson has written a very interesting book about this chap.
He was an anarchist, and he was very much in favour of the strike, and it was his bookshop that used to spread the material around the city and he used to advertise in the Maryland Worker as well. So that man had his office up there. There was a tea shop, I think, on the floor. He had his tailor shop there as well as his place.
And he imported anarchists and other socialist and revolutionary texts from around the world and sold them from here, and they would have anarchist meetings there, and also in 1913, in the middle of the year, they set up the Freedom Group, which was possibly the first anarchist society in New Zealand. They even held anarchist dances where, and socials, which unlike the other socials of the time didn't have a chairperson or anything, or chairman or anything. Everyone sat in a circle and just got up and danced and did their things. So these guys, of course, were very strongly in favour of the strike.
One woman, she had a baton in her house that if you look across between the Mercure Hotel and the pine trees up on the Scally, just straight through the middle there, that was where the terrace jail was. It is important in terms of the strike because that's where many of the strike leaders were imprisoned.
Peter Fraser was held up there. Harry Holland, who was the editor of Maryland Worker, who later became the leader of the opposition. He died before he became Prime Minister. He was there. Tom Young, who was the head of the Seamen's Union and president of the Federation of Labour, was held there.
Stokers and seamen went on strike and disobeyed their captains on their ships, and they were imprisoned as well. The 28 sailors or stokers in the fires from a boat called the Power, they were also imprisoned. So some of the seamen were jailed as well for disobeying orders and going on strike. And that's where they ended up. Okay, we'll move over the road.
One group of strike supporters was charged by the specials and actually ran into the church here for sanctuary in a very sort of medieval scenario. And in this whole kerfuffle, it was also reported that in one of the buildings around here, and I don't know which one, it may have been this thing over here, a well-known medical man was seen carrying with a rifle at the window, which he later claimed he just had for cleaning. But it seems a rather strange thing that at a time of such civil strife there'd be a chap at the window with his gun.
Down in its new position. That's significant, and I stopped there to talk about a woman called Marjorie Lees. She was on Spectrum Radio some time ago and was repeated last Sunday. An elderly woman who would be now dead. She was interviewed about 1970. She was a girl at the time of the strike, and she reports that her father, who was a lawyer, as soon as the strike broke out, he enrolled as a special and came home after the first run with the horses and was so horrified at the terrible things that were going on from both sides that he shipped his wife and daughter up country to get out of the city. He thought that we were in for another French Revolution, and it was a class war, really. And but anyway, the girl, who was quite young, a young teenager, agitated with her parents to be able to come back into the city, and she did come back, and she worked for the Red Cross volunteered, and she worked in the Starboat Shed as a serving tea, because the Red Cross took over the job of serving the specials with morning and afternoon teas wherever they wanted it. And she remembers being stirred. I can't remember the words she used, but this young man came in for a cup of tea and she served it. It was Tiny Freiberg. He would have been a young farmer in those days, and she said, "I met this man. He's called Tiny Freiberg, or Bern Freiberg." And of course, he left later on to be our Governor General. So that was what happened there down in the Starboat Shed. The Albemarle Hotel was had a significant role to play in the strike.
Very famous hotel, and later apparently it was in later years apparently became a brothel and all kinds of interesting things. And apparently some rich chap was brought in and was going to not pull it down, which is rather good to know. But in 1913, this place was run by a chap called Otto England, who was a Swedish socialist. And he was very staunch, and he had it essentially as one of the unofficial strike headquarters. A lot of people from out of town came in to support the strike, and they based themselves here. And Peter Fraser, I think, was actually living in Wellington at the time. He based himself there as well. And so Tom Barker, who was the wobbly guy that I was telling you about, who was in jail later on, he was there. Essentially this place became this hotbed of conspirators sitting up late into the night, planning actions, doing all the very dodgy sorts of things. You imagine it would have been definitely smoke-filled rooms in those days, because they're all busy puffing around their pipes and so on. And it would have been great to be a fly on the wall. And there's so many people staying there, connected with the strike, that a lot of them were sleeping on the floor. And Tom Barker, many years later, said, "Oh, he got a bed, but Peter Fraser slept on the floor, and that must be why Fraser ended up being the Prime Minister and he didn't." But no, it would have been a very interesting sight. I'm reckoning you could do a very good sort of drama or something that set in there.
If you look up here, you'll see that it's the photographers, and this was the photography shop place that recently the discovered the old plates.
I think possibly this very famous photo of the strike of the special was possibly taken here. This is the way the guys were dressed on Wednesday, just like that.
But you say they were sort of in, contingents or whatever. How many horses in each one would there have been?
Sure, there was 1,000 men to be patrolling, so I don't know how big the groups would have been. A reasonable number for safety reasons. Yeah.
So they had 1,000 mounted specials and 1,000 foot.
Specials, so probably I heard somewhere there was about 600 men on horses, but the foot specials were patrolling as well.
Right, yeah.
And whether they were with the horses or not, I don't know. This is probably the best view you have of 1913, where every building was probably here in 1913.
Around here used to be the site of the Olympia skating rink in 1913, which was a major recreational venue, obviously. They'd have bands playing there when people were skating and so on. Brass bands used to perform at all kinds of things at this day when they had big picnics, like the Labour Day picnic, which occurred during the time. The Watersiders Brass Band played the Labour Day in 1913 occurred during the strike. The Watersiders Band, which was actually only a year old at the time, played over at Days Bay, and 2,500 people went to the Labour Day picnic there, which was actually down on numbers from usual apparently. So things like Labour Day, those sort of public events were huge. Brass bands performed at all these sorts of things, including at the Olympia skating rink and stuff. And during the strike, the Watersiders Band led a lot of the marches. So they were holding meetings at the skating rink. And one particularly important meeting to illustrate the sort of Māori position on the strike. There was a meeting of several thousand strikers. This is near the end of the strike, in fact. And I'll just see if I've got my date right there. 4th of December. Now from August through to December, there's this fine check here, there had been a ongoing series of meetings that leaders of the Māori councils had held in Wellington. They come down and they were meeting with Minister of Native Affairs, William Harries, and they weren't getting very far with things, but it did mean that at various times, I'm not sure if they were there for all those months or whether they were going back and forth between the areas and Wellington, but a lot of Māori leaders were in Wellington over this time. Tareti Te Hauhau Tukino was the ariki or high chief of Ngāti Tūwharetoa, and the Te Hauhau's are still very important in the whole Māori scene in general, and they were at that time as well. At the 4th of December meeting, Tareti Te Hauhau spoke to strikers, spoke in Māori, and his speech was translated by a chap called Tuiti Makarane, or Tuiti MacDonald, who was a Ngāi Tahu leader. He'd also been a watersider at different times. He was a supporter of the strike apparently. He later became Southern Māori MP. And today, Tuiti MacDonald's translation of Te Hauhau's speech, and we only have the Māori Land Worker report of this, so we only have an English translation from a reporter from an English translation of the Māori speech, so you've got to bear that in mind as to... but apparently Te Hauhau spoke in support of the strike and pledged to try and persuade Māori not to act as specials or as strike breakers. So at this time, the vast majority of the Māori population was rural, and some of them, like other rural people, had joined either strike breakers or specials around the country. But Te Hauhau was basically saying that they could relate to what was happening to the workers because of their own struggles that were going on over land and so on, and that he wanted to try and persuade Māori not to act as against the strike during this time. So the strike was largely a Pākehā affair, but this particular speech just gives an interesting sideline of a Māori input and approach to it, and also the fact that of course there wasn't just one Māori opinion on it, but there was obviously a range of reactions to it. This is the site of the Royal Tiger Hotel. The Royal Tiger Hotel was significant because it was right next to Buckle Street where the specials were being billeted, and it became known early on as the specials drinking spot.
Yeah, the Royal Tiger. It was significant because it's here where the specials used to come to drink. And there was a lot of talk that there was a lot of alcohol drunk before these guys got on their horses and ran. And the alcohol made a significant part of what took place. And the mayor, John Lukes, he, after the 5th of November battle, he closed all hotels in Wellington. The union supported that at the time because alcohol was becoming a huge issue. The Royal Tiger was the scene of a major fight after this, on about the 3rd and 4th of November, just prior to the battle.
Mount Cook was a working class neighbourhood. In fact, a lot of the people probably doing the rioting and that weren't necessarily strikers at all, but local people really annoyed about the specials being in their neighbourhood and throwing their weight around. And this, what was the Royal Tiger pub then, became a centre of that because it was known as their drinking spot. And for 2 nights in a row, on the 3rd and 4th of November, they besieged the Royal Tiger and smashed all the windows of the pub. There was various charges again by specials, and I think once again there were shots fired around the place and so on.
And the Royal Tiger Hotel was a special pub, but it was built in this area which was a poor working men's area, so that it also had been a working men's pub. So of course, fired up with booze, it became a real focus for fights and attacks and all kinds of things. And there is a story on the night of the 4th and 3rd of November, there was a real lot of fighting out here and noisy, and there was a woman called Mrs. McIntosh. I've got McIntosh ancestors, a woman called Mrs. McIntosh, and she was really upset by the noise. And the next morning she was taken to hospital, and she had a small operation, and she died. Now, whether or not you could say that the strike caused her death is debatable, but that's the only actual death that's anyway connected to the strike, unfortunately. But it was pretty noisy, I suppose. She maybe had a heart problem, who knows, we don't know. So on the night of the 4th and 5th of November, this was also a big lot of action around here. Because we're not far, you see, from the Buckle Street Barracks. That building with the green on it, just behind that, that was the big drill hall where the men were sleeping. and one on the other side was the stores, where all the stores were held. So we're really, and that was blocked off by an armed army with bayonets drawn.
And a little bit further up, Taranaki Street was another place called McFarlane's Bakery, which again we have a photo of here. Shots were fired from the veranda of McFarlane's Bakery at the specials by someone with a revolver. But McFarlane's Bakery was seen to be selling bread to the specials, so they smashed all the windows at McFarlane's Bakery as well. So you can see the dangers of trading with the specials. But when on the 29th of October, no 30th of October, they moved the specials up to base them at Buckle Street Barracks. This building here was Mount Cook Infant School. Those were used to billet the specials. By the end of it, there was about 1,000 specials billeted up there. What you did get right from the start was the area was besieged by the local population. So they literally put out soldiers with bayonets. They set up a machine gun at each end of Buckle Street to keep the strike down. Luckily, the machine guns were never used and the bayonets were never used, but there were two major riots went on there. The main one being on I think on the 3rd of November. The specials charged made charges against the strike supporters. There were revolvers fired. A young chap called Pat Lawler, who was a reporter there, rushed back to Dominion reporting on the firing of revolvers at by both lots. The editor was convinced that this couldn't have happened, got Cullen in, who assured him, Cullen, the Commissioner of Police, that it had only been the strike supporters who'd fired, so that was what went in the papers. But Sydney newspapers reported that both revolvers were freely used by both sides.
And they had armed soldiers with bayonets at each end and Gatling guns, machine guns, never used, but they had them at each end in case. And here you can see the strikers probably standing about where we are, or a bit further along, and all the specials gathering on the other side with the soldiers in between. This was Alexandra Barracks. Had been since 1860.
And it couldn't take all 1,000 of them, so some of them were actually in the old Mount Cook school as well. But this is where lots of them were. So not exactly savoury, you might say.
They were provided with straw to fill pillowcases if they wanted to, or just sleep straight on the straw. And here are all the specials in long queues. This is where they sleep, inside the garrison hall. Here's where they fed them. The army fed them here. When they were down there, the city council paid for their food, and they paid for the Red Cross to feed them, and when they were going around the city. But at night, on breakfast, they were fed in the drill hall by the army.
Now there's the Mount Cook. There's the police barracks.
Yeah.
And you can see the types of housing around it. That was one of the sites the specials were billeted at.
And then in Newtown Park, a really big meeting together, and they would have the speakers, the ones that were in for inflammatory speeches, would make some of the speeches here.
Before the big turn up of the specials, but when the big meetings have been happening in Post Office Square, and they'd stopped the work on the wharves, they had one of the big meetings on a Sunday, I think it was 26th of October, and they decided they would march down to the Basin Reserve, but they'd been forbidden by the council from being able to use it. But the Watersiders band got up leading the march, and they went down, and they decided they weren't going to go to the Opera House and that they would take it to the Basin Reserve. So the band led the whole crowd, there were several thousand of them. They got to the reserve. The crowd were locked out of the reserve, so what they did is they just, discovering the power that a crowd has, as those of you maybe things like Springbok will remember, they simply tore down the gates, charged on in and held their meeting anyway. And it was at that particular meeting that I think Tom Young and several of the others and Harry Holland made the speeches for which they were later, or some of the speeches for which they were later arrested for sedition. One of the leaders of the strike was a chap called Pat Hickey. He was a coal miner who'd become a union leader. A lot of the leaders of the Red Federation were miners, and a lot of these people went on to be major figures in the Labour government of the 30s. Poor old Pat didn't, because he was dead by that time and went off to Australia. But I'll give you a taste of the type of speaking of the time. A version of the speech from the 26th of October 1913. The strikers marched down to the Basin Reserve to hold a meeting led by the Waterside Workers Union brass band. The gates of the Basin Reserve were locked against them. The workers simply tore down the gates and marched into the Basin Reserve and took it over. And Pat made this speech referring to the fact that the Watersiders had been, they held a stop work meeting to discuss this dispute going on, and when they came back to their jobs, they'd been given to other people, which was the incident that sparked the major strike in Wellington. So Pat was referring to that in his speech, which was sort of ironic because Pat was known as the Hell with Agreements Hickey because of an article he'd written saying that workers owed their first duty to each other, not to agreements they'd made with the bosses. However, Pat thought the bosses should stick with their agreements though. And here he goes. There is a big principle at stake in the current struggle. Whether employers are permitted to tear up an agreement simply because workers have called a meeting to discuss an industrial matter. For the past 2 or 3 years, workers have been on the retreat. We've tried to maintain industrial peace, but workers were crucified last year at Waihi, where the miners' union was smashed and where unionist Fred Evans, our comrade, was killed. Workers were crucified last year at Timaru, where they refused to handle scab meat, only to have their union wrecked and a scab union set up in its place. The same thing has happened at Kaitangata and at Huntly, and it's been going on all around the country. We will not be party to retreating another inch. If we lose, we go down like men. Woman. We go down like men with the red flag flying. And our opponents will know that there's been a fight. Remember, workers are only ever defeated by traitors in their own ranks. Men, if you can call them men, who are willing to take on the brand of the scab. We must cut off the scab supply in New Zealand. This fight will be no kid glove affair. We must realise our responsibility to the organised working class. Organised labour will support the Watersiders to the end. If we do not support them, organised labour will not be worthy of the name and should get out of the business.
Sounds good to me.
The capitalist press states that the government will use the permanent artillery, the regular army, against us. We just remember this is an attempt to terrorise us, which will not succeed. Now, the regular police have been absolutely impartial and they've committed no aggressions. But the bosses and Square Deal Massey have brought special constables against us. I say let them come, they may find the job more difficult than they expect. The workers are not going to retreat. The workers are going to fight to the finish. Yes! The fight will not be won by staying at home. The fight will be won by every man and every woman being on the firing lines and doing their duty.
This was a poster for a big demonstration in Newtown Park, and Peter Fraser says, "This is a fight for industrial democracy of New Zealand. This is a fight for organisation. This is a fight against armed scabbery. Workers of Wellington, show your manhood." So pretty pushy stuff. And that was Peter Fraser, and he became Prime Minister, of course, later. And at the same time, there was some interesting stuff put out by the Waterside workers' wives. They were saying to the special constables, "Farmers' sons with whom we have no quarrel. You have been deluded by the shipping companies into coming to Wellington to batten and bludgeon into subjection.
under the heels of that great trust which has raised the freight on your butter, cheese and wool? Why rob our children of their bread? Why not stand on your dignity as men? You will never forget your action if murder is committed. Every union in Wellington and New Zealand is with us. The public who cheered you are now hooting you around the streets. You will be branded for life. Why not come out? We will see you safely to the station. Come out, men, come out. So this was the wives trying to get at the farmers. So it's quite interesting, different factions that were involved.
Essentially, the rural people coming into the town to sort things out there were left-wing miners. So they're not unionised, and they're dependent on the rural situation for their jobs. They see it as the strike as a threat to their livelihoods, which it is, because the exports aren't happening, the farming's not happening, and it's also this. For most rural people at the time, the standard values were patriotism and the empire and all that. So these people are a threat to their values as well. So it's sort of an ideological thing too. So you know, it's not true that it is true that it's a class struggle, but a lot of the people doing the fight for the employing class are actually working class people as well, which is generally the way when it gets down to it.
Well, I guess it was a bit like going to war. I mean, it was excitement, wasn't it? And it offered them something different to what they were doing.
And they would have been having a great time.
So,
And also a lot of the people involved were quite young, and for a lot of the young blokes, especially on both sides, it would have been just like, and I remember this too. They would be young guys.
Stuart's hardware was interesting because that's where they made the battens for the specials. They were hickory, they weren't actual battens, they were hickory handles of picks and hammers, and they were shaped, and then obviously a grip put on them of some sort and sold to the city. And as the special signed in, he was issued with his baton.
That used to be Stuart Timber, Glass and Hardware Company. So it was literally a wood turning outfit. And what they did is they were making battens for the strike breakers. And very early on in the strike, 29th of October, there was a mysterious fire in this, it didn't actually burn it all down, but there was a mysterious fire there which, while the strike organisers disclaimed any responsibility at all, it was always assumed that it was an act of arson in opposition to the fact that they were making battens there. But yes, it's interesting, they had essentially a factory right in the middle of Courtenay Place, but that it was being used to make these various weapons for the strike breaking folks.
How many were actually in the strike breakers?
Well, nationwide, I'm not sure. There was at least 1,000 came in from the country to Wellington, but there were probably more than that because I think that some of them might have had to go home and others be brought back in. There was about somewhere between 500 and 800 foot specials recruited in Wellington as well. So those were local people, usually sort of middle class folks or people doing clerical jobs or whatever, or students who were enrolled to be foot specials, so they're given a baton and so on, and they could march around the street telling people what to do. So you had similar large numbers in Auckland, people coming in from Waikato, all those areas, and some down from Northland. And then again, you had specials brought into Christchurch and Dunedin, but I'm not sure of the exact numbers nationwide, but it was in the thousands. The New Zealand troop back then was very left-wing. It became right-wing in the 20s. It was very left-wing in the 1910s, pro-union, pro the strike, and as it had a big circulation, 40,000, it claimed to have the widest circulation of any paper in the country. It was a weekly. There were no socialist or pro-Labour dailies, but the New Zealand Truth was a weekly, and it published throughout the strike articles in favour of the strike, which is sort of hard to believe when you know what it was like later on. Situated right behind you, the King's Theatre, pretty much where Wishbone is now. That was the first purpose-built picture theatre in New Zealand, I think in New Zealand, but certainly in Wellington. During the strike, one of the movies they showed was the 1913 version of Les Miserables, which of course wouldn't have been a musical then, except that you would have had either a pianist or an orchestra or whatever accompanying it. But this was considered very appropriate at the time. Truth, for example, wrote that the citizens of Wellington had just seen these sort of scenes of brutality on the streets of Wellington, and this picture would, show the sort of degradation that occurred through suffering and the enlightenment that could happen through people helping each other out and so on. And crowded houses were expected, and because of this, so they were literally drawing the parallels between what they were seeing on the movie to what was going on in the streets.
That was showing at the time.
Yeah.
The reviews in the paper said, if you want to understand what's happening in the streets of Wellington at this time, the way the workers are being treated, go to Les Miserables, and it's the same thing happening in our own city. So they saw the link between what was happening in Paris with what was happening here in 1913. So that's interesting. And the Social Democrat Party, which was started in the Congress after the Waihi strike, they had a big Congress here in Wellington in 1912, and out of that developed a moderate beginnings of the Labour Party. It was called the Social Democrat Party, and it was just in its infant stage. And the Social Democrat Party, during the strike and just after, had meetings in the Old King's Theatre, and they had huge turnouts. So it was very popular, and a lot of people came to their meetings.
Then, and at one point, once the strike was off really, and the ships were being loaded, there was this picture taken of the Athenic, which was a ship, I think it was bound for Sydney, and the Cossacks were on the waterfront, and there's an article written about the send-off. The first-class passengers cheered the Cossacks on the wharf, and the third-class passengers threw anything they could find, tomatoes, rocks, sticks, stones, or anything. So there was still that difference in attitude to these specials, even when the ship was sailing. And at the end of the strike, this certificate was given to any striker who had been on strike from the union. They got a certificate to say they were in, it says here that Wellington Waterside Workers' Union stood loyal throughout the 1913 strike, and it was signed. So they got a certificate of that.
Well, the strike was essentially defeated in the end because actually, the variety of factors, the fact that it was at a time of year when they didn't have as much economic power because the farm, it wasn't big export time, farmers could come down and do the beef specials. So there's the use of state coercion. There's also the fact that they were able to regain control of the wharves everywhere, so they could get the work going again. And they went to there again. After a while, workers started going back. Eventually, the seamen came to a separate agreement. Once they'd gone back, the others essentially saw it was, the writing was on the wall. The miners stayed out for another month because they were trying to guarantee better conditions themselves, but in the end they all went back under arbitration unions. But the Federation continued to exist. While its numbers dropped, it still maintained a degree of power, and eventually the Alliance of Labour was created out of its ruins, so to speak, and that became another Federation of Labour later. But one big factor that came out of it, very militant IWW folks, quite a few of them went off to Australia, but people like Fraser and Savage and all that, who basically strongly emphasised that it should be done through the industrial action, should be the main way of changing things, and politics wasn't so important. They came to believe, having seen the amount of power the state was able to use against them, that they should have control of the state. So a lot of them moved more into political action from that, and that was one of the factors that led in 1916 to the moderate and militant parties, United Labour Party on the one hand, the moderate, the supposedly militant Social Democratic Party. You've always got to watch those moderate militant labels, but they joined together to become the Labour Party, which went on to try and make a serious bit to take control.
But thank you for coming. That's the end of it.
Thank you very much.